All right, in this video, we're going to talk about text editors and IDEs. So here on our learning objectives, we're going to discuss and compare text editors and IDEs. We're going to download the text editor we're going to be using for class. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about cloud editors versus editors that you can use on your local machine that you can just download and begin to write your code in. So here's, you'll see there's a bunch of different logos for some text editors, some mainstream text editors here, and some logos for some of your more popular IDEs. The big thing about this slide is how do you begin to build applications? You're going to use some type of tool. In our case, we're going to be using a tool called Visual Studio Code, and we're going to download that in just a second here. But this is where you would start to begin to develop your application. You have to download some software, or you can use a cloud-based editor or tool, text editor, to write your code within. And so if we were in class, one of the main things one of the questions I would ask is, what's the difference between a text editor and an IDE? Essentially, an IDE is typically geared towards a specific language or a specific application. For example, how would you build an Android app? Right? There's an IDE out there that's called Android Studio. You would download that tool, that IDE, to your local machine and begin to create your application. How would you create an iOS app? Right? A lot of us have these mobile devices, but how do the software engineers, the developers create these apps? They have to use a tool. And so to create an iOS app, you would use something called Xcode. If you're kind of old school, before Android Studio existed, you would use Eclipse. And so that's this one here. And you would basically download a plugin and begin to do your Android app. But anyway, an IDE is a little bit more powerful. I hate to use this analogy, but an IDE can pretty much do everything that a text editor can do. The analogy is that it's a text editor on steroids, right? My IDE has a debugger, it has a compiler usually built into it. And like I said, it's geared towards a specific language or geared towards a specific application. Here, text editors, we can use to create files and begin to write our code in. In this class, we're going to be doing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And one of the main editors that we'll use, well, one of the editor that I will use in class is called Visual Studio Code. So what I would like for you to do is download Visual Studio Code. So if you go to this URL, code.visualstudio.com, it'll take you to a page that looks like this, and you can begin to download the editor that we'll be using. I've already downloaded this. And like I said, the cool thing about it is that's going to basically look at what machine that you visit this website, this site from, and it'll imply which version you should download. And yours, if you're using a school computer, it's to say download for Windows. So you can click on that button and download for Windows, and it's a pretty quick download. It shouldn't take that long. Once you've downloaded that editor, it's going to look something like this here. And this is what we're going to be using. This is where we're going to start. So once you download it, click on the icon to open up Visual Studio Code. If you can't find the icon, go ahead and search for Visual Studio Code. There's a search glass right next to your toolbar at the bottom of your computer, next to the Windows button on the lower left-hand corner, and type in Visual Studio Code. Once you do that, it'll bring up this window. So here is our editor. Let me just say a few things about the editor here, more specifically these icons. You could click off of this welcome screen. Actually, I won't click off of it now, but well, I'll eventually click off on it. But here, let me just say a few things about these icons. We're going to download a plugin, and then I want to talk about cloud versus local development. This first icon is called the Explorer. This is where you would actually open up a folder and begin to develop your website. You're gonna hear me say this often. Your site is nothing but your website is nothing but a folder or a file, right? But in our case, our websites are nothing but a folder with a bunch of nested files within it. Here is where you begin to search for your files. Here you have what we call source control. Just have some debugging functionality. Here's our extension marketplace, and you may not see this Docker icon, right? I know I went through that pretty fast, but I'll come back and revisit some of these things here in later videos. But just know that this is how you would navigate to the various functionality within Visual Studio Code. Go ahead and click on this extensions marketplace here icon. What I want you to do is I want you to search for a extension called Open in Browser. And you should see Open in Browser. I'm going to click on it here just to make sure that you have the right one. You'll see that it's by an author. The publisher name is TechER. And what I want you to do is install. So mine is already installed. So go ahead and click on that install button, and that will allow you to install the editor. All right. So make sure you do that. We're going to use this plugin, and let me say a little bit more about the extension market. The extension marketplace is essentially some plugins that people have created to make our lives easier as developers. In this case, this particular plugin or extension, what it allows us to do is basically right click on to the file that our code is in, and we can render it in a browser. That's all it does. And like I said, you'll see this in action a little bit later. But right now, I just want you just to basically understand how to open the editor, how to install this particular extension, and then we'll dive into it a little bit later in terms of how to actually use it. All right, let me say a few more things here, and then we'll wrap up this video. Like I said, we're not going to get into any coding here, but more so just to understand that there's different tools that we write our code in, and in this class, I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. So there's something called local development, and there's cloud development. Local development is where you download the editor, just like we did here. We downloaded Visual Studio Code onto our machine, our computer. You'll see me use machine and computer interchangeably, but I downloaded Visual Studio Code onto my machine, and then what I'm going to do is begin to develop or write my code in Visual Studio Code. That will be considered local development. Cloud development is where you don't necessarily need to download an editor. For instance, I should have already had this up, but there are, what's now becoming very popular is these tools called cloud-based editors. And one that I like to use often is called Cloud9. Cloud9 was recently bought out by AWS. AWS is a huge cloud provider. They supply or they offer services for a number of different major companies. But Cloud9 is what we call a cloud-based editor. And here I'll just go to a website here. Let's go to this one here. And while that's loading up here, let me jump back. So local development, like I said, is done on your computer, and you will write your code on your machine. Cloud development is it's a hosted development environment where you would write it in the cloud or write it on somebody else's server. This is becoming very popular because if I were to take my computer and throw it in the ocean or throw it in the lake, guess what? It doesn't matter because all of my code, my development environment is in the cloud, right? But here, if I were to take my computer and throw it in the ocean or throw it in the lake, then my computer is ruined, and it actually, everything that's on my computer is probably going to be unrecoverable. So like I said, if you're traveling, you're in the industry, a lot of teams are starting to navigate towards cloud development because it's all in the cloud, and you can have teams set up in that particular environment. You can collaborate. And like I said, the huge plus about cloud development is that your code is saved, and it doesn't matter which machine that you begin to do development on. So here's my cloud-based editor, right? This is what I use for all of you guys' slides. All of my slide presentations, I developed them in a cloud-based editor, right? And you'll see that it's browser-based. And so I have this kind of this HTML view area here. I have my terminal, and I have my code here. All right. Like I said, this may not make a lot of sense right now, but more so what I want to kind of go over is this idea of editors. There's IDEs, which is basically geared towards a specific language. Then there's text editors, which basically allows you to write your code to develop your application in. And then there's cloud-based and local-based development. Right. So I'm going to end this video here. And like I said, we'll see a lot more about, I'll say a lot more about Visual Studio Code here in the upcoming videos. But make sure you have Visual Studio Code downloaded and ready to go, and we'll pick up with the next video.